comes to the story of the Good Samaritan, a lot of times we can hear the story, we know it very well, and we can think or label the priest and the Levite as the bad guys. They left this man alone. They did not care for him. So, of course, yes, on the surface, we can think of them as being bad. They did not respond in the way that God wanted them to respond. But let's understand, first of all, why they responded in the way they did. The priest and the Levite both had sacred duties to fulfill in the temple. And so this was placing them in a precarious situation. Because for all the priest and Levite knew, the victim could have been dead. And for them, in their roles in the temple, if they came across a corpse and touched, or even let alone touched the corpse, it would render them ritually unclean for several days. And so thus they would not have been able to fulfill their sacred duty in the temple, their role in the temple, so as to be the mediator between heaven and earth. And so for any faithful Jew, again, it would, knowing that it would render them unclean, the risk wasn't too great. So they chose not to take that chance, so that they could again fulfill their role in the sacred temple. And so a lot of times we might think this, and we'll think, okay, well, what was the big deal about ritual purity? And that we also have to understand before we can understand what Jesus is telling us today. For the ancient Jews, and even to this very day, ritual purity is important because it was a way of reminding themselves to be holy as God is holy. In other words, it was a matter of imitating God's holiness at all times and all places and in all circumstances. It was a recognition that human nature was flawed, and human beings needed to be very careful and vigilant in the way they lived so that they could truly reflect the holiness of God. And so to be rendered unclean or impure was thought to be a hindrance for people to reflect the holiness of God. And that's why they focused so much on the ritual purity. That's why the purity laws became so important. But if we look at it in this way, we understand ourselves in a different light. Because yes, ritual purity still is very important. We still need to be in the state of grace in order to receive the Eucharist. But let's understand why. Again, purity deals with reflecting the holiness of God. But for a lot of times, we may just focus on the surface, how we dress, how we look. And Jesus is reminding us that it's not just a matter of how we look. It's not ritual purity and holiness. Becoming more like God is not just on the surface. It is at the heart of who we must be. And so what Jesus proposes to the law, to the Levite and the priest, or to the law scholar in the gospel, is a larger sense of what it means to be holy as God is holy. And so what Jesus presents to us today is simply, again, a larger picture, a larger understanding. Because not only are we supposed to look the part, we are supposed to live the part. It pertains to our actions towards any other human being in need, no matter who they might be. And so that's one of the things that Jesus wants to remind us of. That ritual purity, imitating the holiness of God, is again not just a matter of looking the part. We have to live it. And we have to show mercy and compassion and love to every human being that we meet, no matter who they are. That is at the heart of being as holy as God is holy. If we want to reflect the holiness of God, then again, we not only have to look the part, but we also have to live the part. But the second thing that Jesus wants to remind us of is the fact that this Samaritan in the gospel, out of all the three characters, had every excuse in the book not to help that victim. Because in fact, this Samaritan was looked upon as being the enemy. And the people looked at Samaritans as incapable of doing anything good. But yet it was only this Samaritan who showed this man the compassion and love that God himself would show. And so Jesus again uses this example of the Good Samaritan to remind us that if even non-believers are capable of acting in the holiness that is reflective of God, then how much more ought we to do the same? If those who are not in this church, who we think are not believers, if they can even show compassion and mercy and love to those in need, again, how much more ought we to do the same? And even more, because we believe in Jesus. Because we believe that we are called to reflect the holiness of God. And so Jesus invites us today, encourages us to realize that holiness is much more than just looking the part. Holiness truly is at the heart of who we must say we are, who we say we are. In the sense, again, that we reflect God's holiness by every word, every action, every thought that we have. And in that way, then we can be truly worthy to be in the presence of God. And so today, the Eucharist calls us again to take very seriously that need to be pure in front of God's eyes, to be as holy as God is holy. This Eucharist reminds us once again that we must recommit ourselves to reflecting the holiness of God in everything that we say and do. Because again, if others in the world who are not believers can reflect God's holiness in lives of charity and mercy and compassion, how much more ought we to do the same? And if we are not doing that, then we ought to be really ashamed of ourselves, because we are called to be more. And so God says to us once again, God reminds us once again today, be holy as he is holy, and to follow the example of Christ, and says to us once again, just as Jesus does, we are to go and do likewise.